Hello and welcome to the Corollosphy podcast. This is Chris Muntz, I'm your host, and this is episode 38, Necessity is the Mother of Invention, with Dr. Farrin Manian of Boston's Mass General and Harvard's Medical School. We are here to discuss today the time in which we live where being creative and forging a new path through tools that we've never used before and considerations that we've never had to think about before are going to be part of this new normal that we keep hearing about. The stuff, you even heard Michael McGlynn talk about this on a previous episode. I hope you listened to that. If you didn't, go back and check it out. But one of the things he said is the people who hold on to the old way of doing things need to grow up. And I firmly agree with him on that, that we're going to have to figure out a new way. We're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to forge a path forward. Now, I strongly believe, and I continue to believe, that there is a path forward with us physically near, at least some way near, our students and our singers in the next year. Some places, now of course that's crossing our fingers and that this epidemic doesn't get worse, right? But I think that that's possible. There will be situations and there will be school districts and there will be different organizations that decide we're going to forge ahead and we're going to figure out a way to do this safely. In which case, what do we need to know? We need to know what this virus is, what the risks are. We need to not blow them out of proportion, but we also need to not underestimate them. We've been trying this on this show since the beginning of these COVID episodes. We are trying to right size the response. So we don't want to puff anything up and we don't want to brush anything under the rug. In this conversation, it's going to get real. We're going to talk about, again, some of the real risks that we're facing here. But at the same time, we are also going to reinforce the concept that risk is not binary. It's not going to be safe or not safe. It's going to be a question of how safe or how not safe, and what are the things that we as choral directors can do in order to reduce the risk. Of course, we all know at this point, reducing the risk involves spacing, it involves sanitization, it involves ventilation if you're inside. It's also going to probably involve, for a while, masks. We talk about the concept in this episode of how the virus is being spread. What are the main things to try to avoid when we're creating our classroom environments next year? Because again, like I said, the decision to have a classroom environment is not going to be up to us. So what types of activities, what types of modifications to those activities might we need to be thinking about? Again, necessity is the mother of invention. We have all kinds of amazing capacities as human beings to come up with new ideas. In fact, one of the ways that I am excited about next year of finding that new invention, that new concept, is actually an opportunity for me to introduce you to the newest affiliate on this show, and that's mymusicfolders.com. The folks over at mymusicfolders.com have come up with an amazing invention out of necessity, out of our necessity to cover up our droplets that are coming out of our mouth when we sing, so as few of them as possible enter the room, float around, get inhaled by other singers, and also possibly, depending on where we live, could result in us being able to sing again together. And maybe in the next year, maybe in the next 6 months, it probably depends on where we live. But if you have the opportunity to put a choir together and space them out and ventilate the space and have a productive rehearsal, the tool that you're going to need is the resonance mask by mymusicfolders.com. They are on board with the show. I'm so super excited to be able to bring them on board. The cool thing about this new affiliate, folks, is you can use Corollosphy at checkout, just like you can at all the other affiliates that sponsor this show. But they have a kind of a unique setup over there. First of all, they have kept the overhead of all of their products super, super low. So what we were able to negotiate and work out for you all is a 5% discount when you enter your Corollosphy checkout code. But the thing that's cool about this is that this code will then work on their COVID products. So they have actually quite a few cool sanitization and mask options, but the resonance mask is really, really cool. And I'm going to be publishing a demonstration of that in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be using the mask to show how the overtones are able to, compared to kind of the muffled masks that sit on your face. It's a really exciting opportunity. And I'm going to be showing that to you using Voce Vista, which you've heard a lot about on the show. And so the idea being that we're going to see that singing can happen with masks. It can be done. And if that's, I said on the last episode of COVID stuff, if it's a choice between not singing and singing with a mask, mask me up, mask all the singers up. Let's get this done and let's start singing again as soon as we can. So that's the exciting part. So the way this will work is you'll go over to mymusicfolders.com. You can enter Corollosphy at checkout. It will automatically take 5% off all of your purchases that are mymusicfolders.com products, mychoirrobes.com products, which if you need choir robes in the near future, remember that code. 5% off of a choir robe purchase is a lot of money. So head over there and check out those products. It's really going to help you in your next school year. And of course, as always, a special thanks to the beating heart of the Corollosphy podcast, and that's the group over at Patreon. Just cracked over 40 supporters over there, which is an awesome milestone. I was told early on in the podcast that getting choir directors to join a Patreon group is just not going to happen, so don't even bother with that. And you know what? I've found that that's not true. Conversation matters and conversation is important. And so if you agree with that and you support the mission of this show, I would like to encourage you to head over to patreon.com/Corollosphy. So at the Patreon page for the show, for as little as $3 a month, you can get in the door, so to speak. You've got your behind the scenes content over there. All the Patreon members, regardless of what level they are, get to see what guests are coming up. Sometimes I even have opportunities to let people on Patreon, if they want, throw their questions into the mix. We don't always take advantage of that, but that's okay. You have that option if you'd like. Plus a patron-only episode once a month. Sometimes episodes when we're doing normal choir stuff have extra materials that go in on the Patreon as well. So there's lots of cool things that you can do. And for a lot of people, they just like to be able to vote with their $3 to $5 to $10 a month and say, hey, I support the mission of this show. And that's such an awesome thing. So I really appreciate those folks. Head on over to patreon.com/Corollosphy and join that growing group of awesome directors and listeners. And of course, a special shout out goes to the producer level sponsors over on Patreon for this episode: Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. So as always, in these COVID conversations, I want you to listen to this next conversation with Dr. Manian. It's very enlightening, very informative, but I don't want you to think as you continue to listen that you are going to find the silver bullet that saves your choir season, because that's not what I'm here to try to do. Again, try to provide context, try to provide understanding so that when decisions have to be made, you can be as fully informed and fully contextualized as you possibly can to know what the risks are, who the risks primarily fall upon, and how to inform your singers. Because one of the things that I feel like is just not being discussed, and this probably will come up on a future episode again, one of the things that we're not discussing as a profession right now is how to enfranchise our singers to make these decisions for themselves too, because it's not just about us. In fact, for probably most choir directors, we are going to be at highest risk in the room. For most of our singers, again, because most singers are young in this country. That's a sad thing, but that's something we'll talk about another time. More adults should be singing. But the reality is most of us work with young people. Their risk is less than mine, right? If I'm in my 60s as a choir director, nearing my retirement years, my risk is at the highest of anyone in the room. But we should be having the conversation of how to let the singers have their parents and the adults that they live with and interact with start to have a say in this as well. So if we're going to do that, we need to have the understanding, the context to lead those conversations in our communities, because they're going to look to us. They're going to look to us to be the experts on what is going on in our classrooms. And that's the purpose of this talk. So with that disclaimer, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Farrin Manian. Okay, I'm here with Farrin Manian. Dr. Manian is a doctor at Boston's Mass General, and also, I understand correctly, Dr. Manian, you also are a teacher and you educate at Harvard Medical School. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
That's what an exciting life that must be, unless, of course, you're right in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah, it was exciting before the pandemic. It just got more exciting afterward.
Have you ever been busier than now?
No, no. 4 weeks that was on the wards, and it was very busy. Yes.
Yeah, and we all appreciate, of course, your time, taking your time to come and help us understand what's going on. Of course, pretty much every industry in the world is struggling through how do we now proceed and how do we now move along with our lives. One of the things that is true, of course, is that we're now 6 months into this pandemic, and we can no longer say that we don't know anything about SARS-CoV-2, but it's still too soon to say that we know everything about the virus. And so we're kind of in a weird middle ground. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think this is really a novel virus that the world has really never dealt with before. So, it really has been a steep learning curve for all of us, experts as well as non-experts in the field of infectious disease. We're all in the same kind of a very steep curve of learning. And fortunately, we're in a position to generate information in a very rapid fashion, disseminated in a very rapid fashion, so that we can all educate each other as we deal with it. In a way, if there's going to be a pandemic, it's never a good time to have it, but it's better to have it when you have this much information, technology that we just didn't have before. So that means generating new knowledge in addition to disseminating and sharing that knowledge with everyone else within the scientific community as well as beyond. And without the internet and we got all the new technology that we have scientifically developed just in the last decade or two, we wouldn't be in a position to be able to deal with this virus like we have. So we're in a way, I think we're fortunate that we have the technology to deal with it the best that we could ever deal with.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, even for us lay people, that we've never seen this much data about a disease thrown at us in real time before.
Right.
And that probably has some obviously positive effects for us being able to understand it, but I would imagine also some negative effects if people don't know how to interpret that data, and might lead to a lot of people either, and this is what I feel like I've observed, either taking the data, misinterpreting it to the point where they are panicking and not able to function, all the way to misinterpreting it to think it's just no big deal and I don't need to worry about it at all. And so one of the challenges that I've been dealing with on this show is trying to have clinicians and physicians like yourself help us to find that middle path where we are able to understand the severity of what's going on and what we're facing, but without overblowing or underestimating the problem. So earlier you said that the how busy the last 4 weeks have been. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about what your day-to-day involvement with this virus has been?
Well, it's in my position, it has changed just over the last few months. I basically, at one time, I was kind of like the resource person for COVID-related questions for healthcare workers that were taking care of these patients on the wards if they had questions and you wanted to be available to them. But yet you also have to remember that life goes on. That is that we have a lot of non-COVID patients that still require lots of care, and we cannot obviously ignore them. So you're trying to balance the care of them along with the balance of the COVID patients. It's again, it's not something that we have all experienced before, but I've been really proud of our healthcare workers at the hospital. Everybody is really has done a really yeoman's job to step in and help us pull through this crisis.
That's fantastic. I would like to, if it's okay, dive into what I'm going to call COVID basics, because one of the things, like I was mentioning before, is that if lay people, if we misinterpret if we misunderstand what's going on, then that can lead to some problems of its own. So the first one I want to talk about is how the virus spreads in at least the most typical situation that you feel like you could kind of explain to us. And I'll share first my understanding, and then if it's wrong, I want you to tell me. So my understanding is that the virus, most of the time so far, has been shown to spread in crowded indoor places where prolonged contact in close proximity with people has been there. So in other words, if I'm walking by somebody and just pass by them for a few seconds that's infected, I probably am not in danger. But if I sat down and talked with that person in close proximity for 30 minutes or so, then I might be in trouble. Is that a fair way to describe what's going on?
Yeah, I think I like to preface by saying that transmission of infectious disease is complicated. Let
Yes.
me just put it that way. And it's not just COVID. It's really tuberculosis, influenza. It is really a complicated. And I think one of the things in infectious disease that I have a lot of respect for is really fully understanding that it's not just being exposed to the virus. It has to do also with how many infectious doses you're being exposed to. It depends also on the host, on not just the host expelling all these viruses in the air, but also the person who's being exposed, their immune system. Are they able to handle it? Are they able to deal with it in a symptomatic or asymptomatic way? And then, of course, the third part is what you kind of alluded to, is the environment. How close are you to the person? Is it outdoors? Is it indoors? What's the ventilation system like? And honestly, the person who is infected also varies from in their ability to be infectious. And as you know, you've heard this term super spreaders or super emitters. And it really, I think it would be too simple to say that just because you're infected, you're going to pass it to everybody else. I think we're really understanding that some people are definitely much more efficient at passing it to other people. And it is a respiratory virus. So really, the most efficient way of passing it is goes through the air. That's why it's called a respiratory virus. And yes, I think that you almost need that kind of the elements of perfect storm for this transmission to occur. And certainly, you need to have a person who is capable of passing the virus to other people, whether they're super emitters or super shedders. They need to have enough virus coming out of their, mouth and their, cough, or, just talking, to get it into the air around them. And then you have to have people who are very susceptible to getting it, catching it. And then, of course, you have to create an environment that can happen efficiently. Again, good example would be outdoors, where there's a lot of ventilation and dilution of the outdoor air, versus indoors, like you alluded to, where air is relatively stale at times. The ventilation may not be good, and the virus could be hanging around in the air. So, I think it's probably the best thing to do is to admit that this is a complicated transmission, kind of a example of a respiratory virus. And it's kind of like that really for a lot of other things. Tuberculosis, for example, is a good case. Just because you have TB doesn't mean everybody around you are going to get TB. In fact, when you first of all, when you try to figure out what the source of TB is, half the time you don't know where people got it from. So there's no identified area where they could have got it from. You can't find any person that could have given it to a person. And I think in some ways, my experience also has been that a lot of time we don't know where people are catching it from. I think we do know there are certain outbreaks, and those are easy, but the great majority of the time, we don't really have any idea where people got it from, and except the fact that they must have been exposed to somebody who was infected. So I think admitting that we don't have a full understanding for every case of where or how they got the virus, I think it's probably a good start.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense to me. Definitely wanting to oversimplify it seems to be the natural instinct of most people, because if we oversimplify it, then we can very simply answer and solve the problem. And I think what you're trying to help
Right.
us understand is that's just not how That's not how infectious disease works. One of the things that I've read about, and I want to see if you think this is accurate, that when the folks that are doing the contact tracing with this virus, one of the things they do ask people is, where have you spent time in close proximity around people for 10 to 30 minutes at minimum? Do you think that's a really good way to start, at least with with that contact tracing, or do you think that's not the right question?
No, I think, in public health, honestly, you have to have certain kind of guidelines for people to play. This is pretty much the same with any disease management or epidemic. 10 minutes versus 9 minutes versus 8 minutes versus 11 minutes. People ask that kind of question, like, where did that 10-minute come from? It gives you a framework so that you're not over testing. You're not basically saying everybody's is exposed and at risk versus nobody's exposed. And so it is a good middle ground. We know that the longer you're exposed to a virus, then obviously the more likely you're probably going to get it. Reasonable start. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, that's a good segue. Another thing that has been evolving, of course, and I want to get your opinion on this too, just so that we can try to understand the world around us as we approach, a return to, say, school. Many of my audience are teachers in the fall. And one of the things that's been evolving, of course, is how much, not only how much, but the process by which we are testing for this virus. And I wanted to see if you can help us understand that. One of the things that Dr. McKenzie, who I believe was on my show before, had mentioned that the possibility of thinking about new cases,
yes,
as not necessarily the end all beat all of understanding the viral surge in our area. And of course, we're sitting as we speak right now in the U.S., we're seeing a rise in cases being talked about in the news. But of course, we also would want to look at hospitalizations to see if those are on the rise or going down, deaths from the virus going up or going down. Do you think it's important to look at all three of those metrics in context with each other as well?
Yeah, I really think that this is not a unidimensional virus or disease in terms of how we approach it. We basically have to get as much information, objective information, measured information that we can, looking at different aspects of this disease before we can make a reasonable decision as relates to public health approaches to controlling this virus. So I think and there are different metrics that people have used, different regions, different states. But I think one of the ones that is really common is what is the percentage of people that are testing positive? And this is testing positive preferably for the virus itself, not the antibody, not like if they're exposed to it before. Basically, they still have evidence of the virus usually in their respiratory secretions. And then you keep checking that in a kind of a rolling method every 3 days and measure the percentage of all the tests that are positive for that week or over a 2-week period. And, you want to trend that, and at the minimum, you'd like to see that percentage is going down because those are presumably actual germs in people's respiratory tract, and therefore they must have got it from somewhere, and therefore it may be indication for the level of transmission. Keep testing people as many as you can and trend that so that you actually have evidence that that's going down. And so in terms of being able to say that, yes, we can relax these measures in the community, you really have to have the surge capacity to deal with the onslaught of sick patients. We got to be able to take care of people that cannot take care of themselves at home. And so whether it has to do with hospital beds, ICU beds, ventilators. And so one of the other things that people look at often is, do you have enough hospital beds to take care of, say, all of a sudden 30% increase in your admissions because of the COVID? Can you actually provide care for this surge? Same with the ICU. And if the answer is no, then you can see how you could really get in trouble, like, New York City, for example, where you just literally start running out of beds. You literally start running out of ICU beds. And it is really not a good position to be in as a healthcare provider. So that's another kind of a metric that people look at. And there are several other ones, but you'd like to see the mortality number of deaths go down. You'd like to see the hospitals have the surge capacity. You'd like to see the infection rate, at least based on the screening. You'd like to see all those go in the right direction before you start to get really comfortable with, relaxing your measures in the community.
Yeah, that all sounds like it makes sense. That's just intuitively as a layperson. My instinct all along has been that you can't analyze anything that is very complicated just using one variable, one metric. And it sounds like that's what you're explaining, is that you've got to look at all of this in totality. And a lot of that data, like we said when we first signed on, we've never seen a disease where the public has been seeing all this data. I've got all my tabs pulled up on my computer right now of everything that's going on that's been reported in my state. So it's pretty interesting. You did mention earlier, just a second ago, that this is a virus where older folks, and the cutoff I've been hearing is 65 and older is where really it starts to skyrocket upwards. Of course, there are exceptions with younger people, and we don't want to discount those at all. But 6 months now into the pandemic, one of the things we're seeing is that now that the economies and places are starting to open up more, that we're seeing a lot more younger people test positive, because of course the younger people were stuck in their houses for the spring months, and now they're going out and interacting with people. A lot of younger people are starting to, in their 30s and 40s, are starting to become infected. Do you feel like those age breakdowns of mortality and severe health outcomes for the virus are going to continue in the 65 and older crowd? Or in other words, how solid do you think those cutoffs are?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think initially when the outbreak was reported, based on published studies from China, it really kind of looked like the younger people, like especially those less than 18 years of age, were not getting sick like the older people. But if you actually look at the bar graph of people who are getting hospitalized, the rate of hospitalization by, say, decade of age, so like 20 30 30 to 40 40 to 50, and then so on to over 80 85, you will see that there is a appreciable increase in the number of hospitalizations. I can just see our own hospital. We have a lot of people in their 20s that are hospitalized, and they're really very, very sick. Okay, so we really quickly realized that, yes, if you look at the rate of people need to be hospitalized or wind up very sick, the rate is definitely lower for that younger adult age group, but it actually starts to increase after age 18. Okay, so I think it would be a mistake to just think that a certain age group should be exempt from anything, to be honest with you. I don't think CDC tries to make a distinction between, like, wearing protective equipment just because you're younger. They say everybody needs to wear a mask, for example. Even children over age 2, everybody has to wear a mask. So we don't really try to make a distinction there, because in some ways it doesn't matter if they get sick or have symptoms. If they can pass it along to somebody who really cannot afford to get sick, to me, that is a problem. It's everybody's problem, not just the people that got the infection.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that. And so it sounds like, and just to kind of summarize a little bit what you're saying there, and again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that while the mortality risk might be skewed towards the older folks statistically, again, that's not to discount the risk to anyone else, but just statistically it's skewed. The younger folks are still getting sick. They might have a better chance to, like, once they go to the hospital, they're going to get treatment. They're going to respond better to that treatment. It's still going to kick them in the butt, and they're just more likely to pull through it. Is ultimately, again, that's what I'm trying to just make sure that that I'm understanding the data picture.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the mortality hospitalization rate is definitely lower in people less than 60. It's certainly not zero, and it's definitely higher than people less than 18. So, you know, they medications compared to children.
Right.
And then we also know that people that have no symptoms or very little symptoms are perfectly capable of transmitting this disease to other people who may actually get really sick. So again, to be able to stop the chain of transmission in the community, you really need to have everybody pitch in and do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder now, since you mentioned children, and a lot of the folks that listen, like I said, to the show are teachers, and we're a lot of us are working with those 18 and under type kids. One of the things that another previous guest, Amish Adalja from Johns Hopkins, that was on the show, had mentioned early in May, back before there was a whole lot of information, that's some reason to believe that kids aren't as good at spreading the disease as adults are. You mentioned that certain people do kind of exert more or spew, for lack of an artful term, more viral particles when they exhale and when they breathe. Is there any updates that you know of on that, or are we still in the dark kind of on children as vectors of this?
Yeah, I think I have heard that, but to be honest, I've also seen published reports of kids being a source of infection to other people. Um, we know that kids generally have a more just milder disease, and if you have a milder disease, maybe the system is better, or maybe they just don't have the right kind of receptor for the virus. Whatever it is, maybe the virus is not multiplying in the respiratory tract as much, and so their viral load may not be as high. Some of them could be honestly high, and so there may be reasons why they may not be passing along to other people as efficiently. But there are probably some adults who have very mild disease that may also not be very efficient in passing along. So I have yet to see a peer-reviewed journal article that says, oh, the rate of transmission from children to adults is such and such, and it's this much lower than adults to adults. Again, this is a complicated process because you're looking at a couple of moving parts. The host is infected, and then the person who may get exposed, and there are a lot of variables like we discussed.
All right, great. So let's move along now to well, I guess a little bit back to mode of transmission, because one of the things that I know is a kind of a hot topic in this field right now is the idea of aerosol spread versus droplet spread, and also understanding that those two terms are not necessarily a binary, like that there is a range between what one researcher might call a droplet and in size all the way up to the smaller aerosol particles. And there's kind of an odd mid-range there where, depending on who's talking, one researcher might call them droplets, the other might call them aerosols. And so there's a lot of layperson confusion about this, and it also ties into the science about why wearing masks is helpful, is understanding that process. So what is well, let me phrase it this way. Right now, the CDC website does not include the word aerosol on its page for how the disease spreads. It talks about droplets and close contact, that kind of thing. But I understand that there are lots of researchers now saying that they don't think that's correct. The CDC is missing this one. And so what's your position on that, and how do masks tie into all that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris. I think it is a somewhat of a controversial topic, and it kind of depends on what your opinion is based on all your experience. Yeah, and so this is my opinion on the aerosol airborne aspect of COVID. Basically, respiratory viruses are transmitted through the air. And generally, we kind of divide the mode of transmission by the size of the droplets, which is basically respiratory secretions that are airborne, like they get into the air. And, generally speaking, over the years, infection control, you come in a hospital, we have droplet precautions and we got airborne precautions. Droplet precautions are basically, based on the fact that people that are generating these secretions by coughing and sneezing can be infectious if you're within, and those are the larger droplets of, say, over 5 microns. And that's the kind of the typical respiratory precautions that would put people on in a hospital. If you got a cold or we don't want to, or influenza often, we put people on respiratory precautions. And then there is the airborne, which is more like tuberculosis, and which is basically smaller droplets. We call it droplet nuclei. They're 5 microns or less. And these are, because they're so small, they stay in the air longer, and they can go a lot further because the moisture evaporates. And so when people get exposed to it, they can get exposed to it at further than, say, 3 to 6 feet. And then not only that, it goes straight into your lungs because you're breathing it in because they're very small. Tuberculosis is a good example of that. I think the controversy is SARS-2 or CoV-2 or COVID agent, which category does it fall into? And I think initially everyone was thinking that this would be primarily a droplet precaution type of a disease, that if you're within 3 to 6 feet, you should take precautions, but not if you're beyond that. And initially, as you know, from a public health measure, wearing masks in the public was not something that was recommended. You don't have to wear a mask when you go out there. And then, all of a sudden, essentially, most states, basically now, many states, in the state of Massachusetts, for example, you have to wear a mask when you're out in the public. Regardless of whether you're within 3 to 6 feet, you have to wear a mask. And the question is, changed? Well, what changed is that we found out that there are a lot of people that have absolutely no symptoms that seem to be the source of infection. And you said, well, what does that have to do with droplets? Well, if you think that somebody has no symptoms, you assume that they're not coughing or sneezing, in which case they're not spewing out visible droplets, those larger droplets. And how are they infecting other people if they're not coughing or sneezing? I think that somebody has to ask that question. And the most ready answer would be, well, everybody breathes, right? We breathe out, we breathe in, we talk, we laugh, we sing. I mean, we talk loud. Is it maybe because of that? And in fact, it really looks like we're able to generate these small droplets, or droplet nuclei. Even before there was COVID problem, people were able to document that just talking and breathing can generate these small nuclei, droplet nuclei. And in fact, the size of the virus is such that it could be on these small droplet nuclei and it can be transmitted that way. Because of this asymptomatic transmission of the virus is probably not uncommon at all, I think it became very clear that you're not necessarily going to transmit it just by coughing or sneezing, in which case it becomes more like an airborne disease. And so in the hospital, I can tell you that everybody wears a mask. Everybody put people with SARS-CoV-2 on airborne precautions. There have been studies that show that you can find bits and pieces of the virus outside of patients' rooms with COVID. You can find bits and pieces of the virus in the patient room that's not coughing or sneezing at the time that you measure it. So it really looks like you can potentially generate infected droplet nuclei. And if you're infected with SARS-CoV-2, it could explain why many patients may be getting it without being around somebody who coughs or sneezes. So my personal bias is that when you have outbreaks of, in Boston, you might have heard about the Biogen conference that was right before we had a huge outbreak of COVID-2 in Boston. And it was a conference, and at the same time, and you have to ask, well, what happened? basically it's so efficiently transmitted that you almost have to say, probably not all from the environment, because the virus has to go from the person who's infected to the environment. It has to resist dying on the surface. Somebody has to pick it up and not wash their hands and then get it that way. This is not a very efficient way of transmitting it. Whereas everybody breathes, and if you're breathing in air that has virus particles that can go straight to your lungs, that's a very efficient way of transmitting it. So I personally believe that it can be transmitted by airborne route. That was a long-winded, no pun intended, answer to your question, Chris.
Yeah. So one of the things that one of my layperson confusions about that distinction, because that does make sense to me, but one of the things that I think this causes confusion for a lot of people, especially for people who kind of refuse to wear a mask, which is that if it's true that those tiny particles are the problem, and my homemade cloth mask made out of a t-shirt has holes that are so big that I can see through them, why is that helping me? Or, for example, and these are criticisms I've heard, or for example, if I'm wearing one of those ear loop surgical masks that aren't designed to filter out those tiny particles, how does that help me if it's not protecting me from the big droplets or protecting someone else from the big
Yeah, I agree. I think that you're probably not just protecting yourself. You're not trying to just protect yourself from the small particles. There's still going to be large particles, obviously, and you definitely don't want to get exposed to that. So those masks, even though they don't filter out the small particles, they still give you some protection. And you don't want to fight that we were in. To be honest, we obviously use that when we go in the patient's room. We're taking care of them, and so because the air in that room, somebody that has COVID is probably going to have lots of these particles. And again, it's a matter of risk of how much viral load you're being exposed to. If you're in the public, hopefully you're not being exposed in an environment that has got tons of virus in it, because the person who actually is infected, we expect them to wear a mask as well. And it would be nice if they were able to control their droplets as well. And if you can have two masks, one for the person who is infected and one person that is not infected, that still reduces the chance of transmission. It is not 100%, but we're not trying to have everybody, wear N95s all the time for a couple of reasons. One is that the risk may not be high enough to wear it all the time, because especially you're outdoors. But as you know, there's an N95 shortage as well. A lot of hospitals initially could not even get enough of those. And it is not a practical thing as far as wearing it all day. So you're trying to reduce the risk. You can't obviously reduce to zero if you're going to be in the public. There's always going to be, even N95s, you mentioned it. Yes, it is definitely much better in filtering out things. But in the hospital, you have to be fit tested for it. That is that you have to show that the contour of your nose, your face, whatever it is, that the mask is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And some people, N95 doesn't work for them. And so there's no guarantee that a public who just starts to wear N95, that they're getting well fitted, and so they will do anything. So from a practical aspect, I think it is perfectly fine to wear these regular masks, and for everybody, not just the person who's trying to protect themselves, but people that are trying to protect others from their secretions.
Right. So yeah, so it sounds like the way that it started to make sense to me of why even the homemade masks are at least worth the effort is because I think we talked about this earlier when you first came on. The total viral dose matters over time. So even if your homemade mask doesn't filter like an N95 does, it's going to filter a portion, and maybe a significant portion, because I'm assuming that a large droplet would contain a lot more virus than some of those tiny, particles in the air. And if you can at least filter out that bulk of your exhalation, then you're protecting the people around you, even if it's not 100%.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And I think the reason that a lot of states or municipalities are concerned about, opening restaurants and bars and stuff indoors is regardless of whether you wear a mask or not, they want to keep the number of people indoors to a minimum, maybe 25% of their capacity, along with social distancing and the mask. And that's because you're trying to minimize the amount of virus in the room, in the establishment, because people are talking, they're laughing they're loud, and you can generate a lot of droplets during that time. But hopefully you won't generate so much that the concentration of the virus gets so high that you're going to be at risk. You still need to wear a mask because there are going to be people that may be close to you. And it's still going to be probably a higher risk than if you were outdoors. And I think a lot of people started, providing tables outdoors for that reason. But, the indoors is still a concern. To me, when you have a lot of people congregating inside an enclosed space and they're talking and, having a good time like we all like to do. The air in there is basically a cumulative concentration of the virus that's been hanging around for hours. And so I do get more worried about people going into these establishments, even with a mask. I tell people I would probably avoid going inside unless you really have to.
Now, yeah, no, I hear you. I hear what you're saying there too, and see if I can put again. My function is to put this in lay people's terms for my listeners. So, and the analogy there is of course to that large droplets, you're going to get a whole bunch. You might get a whole bunch inside of you like right away, but also if you sat inside with a bunch of these particles that are just hanging around, they might be smaller doses, but you're sitting there for a long period of time. And over the course of the time that you're there, your immune system would no longer be able to keep up with that dose. Is that true? Am I getting it?
Yeah. You're right. So the distinction that I would make, I probably failed to make it at the beginning, but the larger droplets, of course, they're large and the polar gravity will get them out of the air, within seconds, to basically drop down to the ground or the floor. Whereas the droplet nuclei, the small ones that are very light and they're kind of like hang around in the air, they actually stay there. And then if somebody else comes in with COVID, they add to the previous person's contribution to the contaminated air. And then the third person comes in, and you can see that there's enough of an overlap that you can actually have a very relatively high concentration of the virus in the ambient air. And so that when you walk in and you're there to just enjoy your meal, you may be breathing the air that has been left behind with these small droplets. Even if these persons are no longer there and talking or anything, this is kind of what they might have left behind. And so and then these tiny droplets are going to not necessarily be stopped in the nose or the mucosal surface of the upper respiratory tract, we call it, but they can just be directly breathed into your lungs, in which case you may just have absolutely no immune response. You can't stop it, and then you can get really a severe illness. So the airborne transmission is more than just an academic type of discussion, like, oh, I wonder how small the size is. It really makes sense that you want to stop that by not creating an environment that has a lot of these droplets in the air so that people can breathe in.
Okay, got it. So I'm going to have us move now into the singing specific realm a little bit, just because that's, of course, what most of my listeners are hoping to hear us talk about. And so I'm going to set up a scenario for you and just let you respond to it. So if I am in an area of the country, because as we know, the virus kind of behaves differently. I shouldn't say it, the virus doesn't behave differently, but the virus impact varies by region. You've got some areas that still have, lots of counties in the U.S. that still have had zero cases. They're isolated geographically. They don't have very many people, that kind of thing. And so there is a variance. And so a lot of these decisions are going to be made at the county level, the local level, of what types of things we're allowed to do. So in my scenario that I'm setting up here, we're fast forwarding in time to a place earlier in the episode. You said you're looking at that metric for percent positive tests are declining. And your local health department has said it's safe to open up the school. It's safe to open up your church again. Go ahead and do that. We should still be careful because the virus is still here, but it's declining. And at that point, people are starting to come back inside to the buildings that we've been missing for so long. And we still want to do certain risk mitigators like social distancing and mask wearing and all of those types of things. Can you see it in that scenario? And of course, we've got no way to know when that will be right now. But can you see a scenario where, judging by all the information you just shared with us about how this virus works, that we would be in a reasonable position to say, if we had a choir that wanted to sing, we're trying to ventilate the space as best we can. We're trying to maximize spacing to the best we can, and possibly even wearing a mask to filter out as many of the droplets as we possibly can. Is that a pretty major risk reduction strategy, do you think, or is that not even worth our time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So we definitely, the COVID virus has definitely forced us to think about the risks in our lives. We had them before, now we have even more of it. And what we are willing to take as a risk and what we're not willing to take as a risk in our everyday decision making in our lives. And I like to just kind of go back to zero risk versus a full, very high risk behavior. Zero risk, of course, is as long as there is virus in the community, as long as there is not a whole lot of immunity to this virus in our communities, and right now most people basically say, unless we have a vaccine, we're probably not going effective vaccine. We're probably not going to be able to be very confident that we have a very immune population. But as long as we have a lot of susceptible people, and we are actually having physical, contact with each other, or congregating in areas where things can be passed on through the air, especially. As long as we have that scenario, then it's not going to be zero risk. Okay. Now, if you congregate and there are no masks and everybody's doing what they did like before COVID, then that's a very, very high risk. So you have, on the one hand, you have very high risk situations and you have zero risk. Zero risk is exactly what we're doing right now. Virtual discussion. There's no way I'm not exposed, you're not exposed. Anything in between is going to be having some risk.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely don't envision a scenario. In fact, I said on a previous episode of this show that I don't even necessarily know that I buy that there would be zero risk after we have a vaccine, just because there's also side effects of vaccines. There's, some even really successful vaccines have some people that it just doesn't work on them, or those types of things. And so I agree with your portrayal there of risk being kind of a big spectrum, all the way from I'm not going to even take my covers off and leave my bed today. That's about the safest thing you could do, all the way to skydiving without a parachute. I've even heard of people living through that. So there's this big spectrum. I guess what I'm trying to have you help explain to us is, in very much like you're doing, is that for me as a teacher, the decision about whether or not I get, school opens up and certain activities start to happen again is not going to be up to me. We're going to be told by our districts and across the country and our states and all these different things of what we can do and when school starts again and that kind of thing. And so I guess really what I'm wanting to have you help me think through with this is, at some point I'm going to be told it's go time, go back to whatever it is that you do. And so, so to me, the things I'm thinking about are ventilating the space, spacing out the singers as much as it can. There very well could be still, by the time we start again, the need for masks based on the viral spread in our area. If I've got too many kids in a space, looking for a bigger space that we can spread out even more, possibly rehearsing outside, all those types of things. Do you see validity, I guess, in that approach?
Yeah, I think what this virus is doing to us, among many things, is really forcing us to be creative, creative in all kinds of facets of our lives. Uh, honestly, I think we're doing so many things that, I mean, obviously, like right now, who would have thought that a lot of teaching now goes on online? I mean, it's like, I don't know, Chris, how much of your teaching you've been able to do online, but I can tell you that at my hospital, for example, all of our committee meetings, all the things that we thought were so essential to be right there, so personal to talk about our cases, and just really we got so much out of it. Everything's online, and I think somebody told me, hey, this is the way it's going to be. I probably say that's kind of crazy. uh, so the first thing I would do is, and your situation certainly a lot better than I do, is to accept the fact that you have to be creative, and accept the fact that normal times are not going to be here anytime soon. Okay, so I think that's a given. Within that realm of limitations, what can we do to get the maximum uh, from the resources that we have, without putting people in undue risk of transmission? Number one is personal is congregating children or students physically in a place. Is that absolutely essential? And the answer, maybe yes. We have to actually have physical presence in a group fashion. Number two is how many people do you need to have to say that this is very effective? The larger the number, obviously, the more you're dealing with the chance that somebody's going to have something. So some people said, like in Massachusetts, was like no more than 10 people can get together, and that's it. It really has to do with the fact that the more number of students or people gather around each other, there's going to be a likelihood that one of them is going to have it, and they can be a super emitter and then give it to other people. So the minimizing, if you think that you have to have physical congregation of people, okay, that's fine. And then number two is how many is absolutely necessary. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20? And then if you really feel like, boy, it's just going to be hard to have that many people inside an enclosure and still guarantee social distancing. And then based on the activity of what's going on, singing or talking loud, like I said, if the ventilation is not going to be good in your school, for example, if the gym just says, no, we just can't, we've had problem with ventilation and stuff, then you have to think about, can I have this outside? Can I actually have something outdoors? Maybe at least during the time that the weather permits. But I don't know whether people can sing with a mask on, Chris. I don't know if whether that's a even possibility. You obviously can't sing or can't play any kind of wind instruments or flute or something with a mask. So there are going to be times where you can be creative, but it may not apply to, depending on what the activity really is. So how important is it? Is it absolutely crucial? Is it crucial? Then how can we minimize the number of people? And then if we can minimize that, can we guarantee that the ventilation system is going to be good enough based on social distancing? And then if we can't, or if there's any question, or if it can be done outside, then you go to the outdoors. Is the risk going to be zero? Of course not. We just said, unless it's virtual, it's probably zero. Even with the vaccine, you're right. You're not going to be dealing with the zero risk. But I think it's time to be creative. And if the school is asking you to do certain things, then I think the science is there to help us come up with a plan that may be reasonable. And certainly you can talk to the health department as well, because I think it's really important, because whatever you do, I think probably is going to be looked at by other schools, and you want to be somewhat uniform in your approach. But yeah, I think it's time to be creative.
Yeah, absolutely. That all makes sense, and I think your point about the singing with the mask is interesting because, of course, in the spirit of being creative, we've got some companies that are looking at singing specific masks. The idea that certain types would be fitted to your head so that it's the right size to get the best possible seal. And we've got this resonance singing mask that's just coming out now, where it's got kind of a wiring system on the inside where it extends out a little bit from your face so that it doesn't touch your lips while you're singing. And it looks really interesting and really promising, because then you can still feel the sensation of singing, rather than having it kind of pressed up against your face. So yeah, it's exactly right. The necessity is the mother of invention. And because for a lot of us, of course, singing is crucial. Singing is essential. It's our job. It's how we pay our mortgage. So it just like all these other industries like restaurants and bars and everybody else, they've got to be creative and figure out a way to offer their service as safely as they possibly can. And I think we're now in the performing arts industry, we are now kind of being forced to be in that spot too, where a lot of us have just paused everything that we're doing. I haven't had kids singing in a group since March. So, but at the same time, I'm lucky because it's summer vacation. So I don't have to have kids singing right now. I can wait and try to have these conversations and do these interviews and try to find this information and wait for studies to come out and those types of things. So very much appreciate your time thinking through this. On the way out, I just want to kind of bounce this one more concept off of you, and it just has to do with still kind of a mask conversation, so kind of one more exclamation point on this masks and how they affect aerosols question, because I really want to get clear on this. So if I'm wearing a mask, and let's assume that it's pretty good quality and it's fitted well, but it's not an N95, I am still putting out aerosols into the room when I breathe through that mask, the small particles. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how much of the percentage of air that you're exhaling is tiny particles versus larger particles, obviously. But you're obviously reducing the number of viruses, either on the large particles or the small particles, into the environment. So, there's been some what we'll call like meta-analyses of masks in terms of protecting, the transmission people from getting COVID, and 70-80% effectiveness with the mask. And these are not N95 masks. So it's not 100%, but it definitely is better than not wearing a mask.
Right. So it's a reducer. It's just a risk reducer. Right. It's not a risk eliminator. And then of course the other things that we discussed that are risk reducers are the social distancing, the ventilation, those types of things that you're thinking about as just notching the risk down as much as you possibly can. Yeah, absolutely. All of that makes sense. Well, I appreciate your time. I'm going to let you get back to your busy job being a superhero and fighting the disease for us. We very much appreciate all of you, what you guys are doing on the front lines with all this, and of course taking some time to talk to us about it.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for allowing me to discuss these important issues. And if I could just have one parting word, Chris.
Yeah.
I really want your audience to take this virus very, very seriously. There is some doubt about the impact this virus is having on the people, from just the person who's caring for these patients, sees in the hospital. I really, really want everybody to get really serious about this virus. And again, we're all in this together, and we really need the public's help to pull through this. So thank you again for allowing me to talk to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Well, thanks everybody again, as always, for listening all the way through to the end of an episode. I hope you're learning. I am sure learning a whole lot about COVID-19 and about this virus through the process of these COVID conversations. But I got to tell you, I am ready to talk about music again. It's getting really exhausting, but I care about us and I care about this profession a lot. My 8-year-old son, and this is an actual quote, not too long ago, said, "Daddy's stupid podcast is supposed to be about choir, but lately it's just about COVID-19. And he said it with such disdain because I've been working so hard on this to try to make sure that as many of my colleagues as possible understand what we're facing and understand it in as much context as possible, because as I've said so many times, we're going to at some point in the near future be put in a position where we need to know stuff. We're going to be told by somebody above us, here are a set of rules, go make it work within that set of rules, right? Our county is going to pass it to our school district, and our school district is going to pass it to our administrators, and our administrators are going to pass it to us, and we're going to have to implement these things. And so just as much knowledge as we can possibly have, in my opinion, the better. That's what's been motivating me, and I hope you're finding it beneficial. There are just so many ways that you can help spread the word and help the mission of this show if you feel so inclined. If you're still listening, that means you're probably invested in some way. So share, subscribe, do all the things that you got to do on the internet content platforms that really help. Leave a rating, leave a comment in any capacity you can. You can do it on Apple Podcasts. You can do it on Facebook. You can do it on YouTube. Any traffic on the Corollosphy podcast content helps other people see it. That's how the interwebs works. So anytime you interact, even if it's just to say, hi, thanks for the podcast, or calling out a cool, interesting fact that you learned and typing it in somewhere, helps other people see it. Of course, you also want to head over for your sheet music needs to ryanmain.com and graphitepublishing.com. I know it might be a little while before we need some sheet music, but just keep them in your thoughts for the next time you're ordering. You can use the Corollosphy checkout code there to get 10% off. Also, you're going to want to head over to vocevista.com/Corollosphy and get yourself a copy of that software. You can play with it for 30 days for free. You're going to want to buy it, though, before school starts. It's going to be an amazing tool for online learning, also in-class learning. It's a resonance software that measures and shows pictures, amazingly detailed, beautiful pictures of the Overtone series of the singer. So that's a cool product. As well as, of course, Sightreadingfactory.com. You got to get those memberships ready to go, again, for in-person or online learning. And for all of those websites, you can enter Corollosphy at checkout to get a discount. And finally, last but not least, head over to Patreon. Patreon.com/Corollosphy is your best way to support the show. But like I said, I just want you to be part of the conversation. I want everything on this show to be free for as long as possible. The best way you can help me do that is all the things I just listed. Interact, say hi, send a share, head over to Patreon, use the sponsors. These are all the things that help keep the lights on so I can keep doing this like forever. That would be awesome. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you later.